London, 1895. The world outside is disappearing. A thick silver mist has claimed the cobblestones of Baker Street, turning the chaotic city into a silent velvet dream. Inside our sitting room, the only clock that matters is the slow, steady rhythm of the burning wood in the hearth. You are safe here. The tea is warm, the chair is deep, and the night is long. Forget the world you know. We are stepping back into the shadows of a time where logic was the only lantern in the fog. Sherlock Holmes sits across from me, a silhouette of perfect composure bathed in the amber pulse of the firelight. He does not move, yet his mind is traveling through a labyrinth we are about to enter together. There is a specific, heavy silence in 221B this evening, a silence that holds the scent of old parchment, Moroccan leather, and the faint lingering spice of tobacco. My friend's long fingers are resting upon a single, cream-colored envelope. It is an object of quiet defiance, undisturbed by any seal or postmark. We are not looking for a criminal tonight. We are looking for a ghost, a man who claims to breathe, think, and exist exactly as Sherlock Holmes does. As the fog presses against the glass, listen to the settling of the embers. The mystery is unfolding, not with a clamor, but with the soft, deliberate breath of a secret waiting to be told. I watched him through the haze of my own pipe smoke, noting the way his eyes remained fixed upon that singular piece of vellum. In the quietude of our quarters, every small sound became magnified, a part of the tapestry of our sanctuary. The distant, muffled cadence of horse hooves on the damp pavement below felt like a heartbeat from another life, rhythmic and distant. Holmes has always possessed the ability to inhabit a moment so fully that the rest of the world seems to fade into insignificance. It is a quality of absolute focus, a stillness that precedes the storm of deduction. The room itself seemed to exhale with us, the warmth of the fire creating a sensory cocoon that invited the mind to wander away from the mundane and into the realms of the extraordinary. This was a morning designed for the slow unraveling of knots. The light from the street lamps, struggling against the encroaching day, cast long, flickering shadows across the stacks of journals and scientific apparatus that littered our table. To any other observer, the scene was one of domestic tranquility, but to those who knew the inhabitant of this room, it was the calm before a profound intellectual upheaval. Holmes looked up then, his gray eyes catching the firelight with a sharp metallic glint. The piece of the morning was merely a canvas upon which a new and darker picture was about to be painted. He held the letter toward me, not with the haste of a man burdened by news, but with the reverence of a scholar handling a rare and dangerous manuscript. I invite you to settle further into your surroundings. Imagine the weight of the air in our Victorian flat, heavy with the history of 1,000 solved enigmas. The dampness of the London streets is a world away from the dry, crackling heat of our hearth. There is a comfort in this isolation, a feeling that within these walls, the chaos of the 19th century can be dissected and understood. The letter in Holmes's hand was heavy, its texture expensive and deliberate. It carried no name, no address, yet it had found its way to the one man in England who could truly perceive its hidden depth. As we begin this journey, let the rhythm of my voice become the rhythm of your own thoughts. There is no urgency here, only the steady progression of a story that demands to be heard in the quiet hours. The fog outside is thickening now, swallowing the lampposts and the hansom cabs, leaving us alone with a challenge that strikes at the very heart of identity. A man had written to Holmes, not to ask for help, but to announce his arrival as a mirror, a shapeshifter of the intellect. The game, as it were, was beginning in the most silent of ways. Relax your mind and listen closely, for the first thread of this intricate web is about to be pulled, and the echoes of what follows will linger long after the fire has turned to ash. We were no longer merely observers of London's shadows. We were about to become the subjects of a gaze that saw everything Holmes saw, and perhaps something more. The mystery is breathing now, steady and calm, waiting for us to take the first step into the mist. Holmes held the cream-colored envelope between his long, nicotine-stained fingers with a degree of care that he usually reserved for fragile chemical retorts. The texture of the paper seemed to intrigue him as much as the lack of a return address. He turned it over slowly, letting the golden firelight wash across its surface, revealing a watermark that was barely visible to the untrained eye. A subtle interlacing pattern of ivy leaves that spoke of a high-quality stationer, likely one situated near the heart of the city. There was no stamp, no postmark, and no sign of a messenger's frantic scrawl. It had appeared on our mantel as if materialized from the very fog that pressed against our windows. My friend's silence was absolute, a meditative state where every nerve was tuned to the physical evidence before him. He slipped a silver letter opener into the fold, the sound of the paper parting being the only intrusion into the quiet hum of the room. The letter inside was brief, yet every word seemed weighted with a calculated precision. As Holmes smoothed the sheet onto the mahogany surface of our table, I leaned forward, my own curiosity piqued by the sudden intensity in his gaze. The handwriting was impeccable sloping, elegant, and possessed of a rhythmic consistency that suggested a person of immense self-control. It did not merely convey information, it issued a quiet, chilling challenge. The writer spoke not of a crime committed, but of a mirror held up to the very soul of the man sitting opposite me. To the one who knows the shadows, the letter began. I am the shadow you have forgotten to cast. It was a declaration of existence from someone who claimed to have mastered the art of observation to such an extent that they could replicate the master himself. I watched the play of emotions across Holmes's face, though to the casual observer, he remained a mask of Victorian stoicism. Only the slight narrowing of his eyes and the rhythmic tapping of his fingers betrayed the rapid gears of his intellect turning within. This was not the erratic rambling of a madman, nor the desperate plea of a victim. It was the opening move in a game of intellectual chess, played by someone who understood the nuances of Holmes's own methods. The letter hinted at a deep, almost intimate knowledge of our previous cases, referencing details that had never been made public in my own accounts. It spoke of the subtle scent of ozone before a storm, the exact number of steps leading up to our door, and the specific resonance of the violin strings when Holmes played in the dead of night. The implications were profound and deeply unsettling. As the morning progressed and the tea grew cold in our cups, the presence of this anonymous correspondent seemed to grow, filling the corners of the room with an invisible weight. Holmes rose from his chair and began to pace the length of the rug, his hands clasped behind his back, his head bowed in deep concentration. He was retracing the steps of his own life, looking for the moment where a shadow might have detached itself to become a separate entity. The fog outside remained a relentless, gray wall, isolating us in our sanctuary of logic. Yet the sanctuary now felt breached by a mind that claimed to be its equal. Every sentence in that letter was a thread, and as Holmes began to pull at them, the complexity of the web became apparent. The writer did not seek wealth or vengeance. They sought recognition. They wanted Holmes to see them, to acknowledge that in the vast, teeming hive of London, there was another who could see through the veil of the mundane with the same piercing clarity. It was a haunting thought, the idea of a double, a shapeshifter of the mind who could walk the same streets, breathe the same air, and deduce the same truths, yet remain entirely hidden. The stillness of the room felt fragile now, a thin membrane separating us from a confrontation that would test the very foundations of identity. Holmes stopped his pacing and looked out at the mist, his reflection in the glass ghostly and thin. We were no longer alone in our pursuit of justice. We were being watched by a version of ourselves that lived in the white spaces between the lines of the law. The letter was not just a message, it was a ghost made manifest in ink and vellum, waiting for the first light of day to reveal its true form. The night had deepened, and with it, the silver shroud of London had thickened into a dense, impenetrable wall of damp wool. Our destination was the British Museum, that vast storehouse of human history that sits like a silent leviathan in the heart of Bloomsbury. As the hansom cab rattled over the uneven stones, the sound of the iron-rimmed wheels was swallowed by the mist, creating a strange sensation of moving through a void. Holmes sat opposite me, his face occasionally illuminated by the flickering amber glow of the street lamps we passed. He was utterly silent, his chin resting upon his gloved hands, his mind already prowling the corridors of the museum. I could feel the coolness of the air seeping through the floorboards of the carriage, a reminder of the world's indifference to the dramas playing out within its shadows. The city felt abandoned, a ghost of itself, where every silhouette of a chimney stack or a wrought iron railing took on a spectral, watchful quality. Upon our arrival, the great Russell Street facade loomed out of the darkness, its massive fluted columns standing like the sentinels of an ancient, forgotten world. The air here was even stiller, heavy with the scent of wet stone and the metallic tang of the nearby iron railings. We were met by a night watchman whose face was a map of anxiety, his lantern trembling slightly as he led us through the cavernous entrance hall. Our footsteps echoed with a hollow, rhythmic cadence against the polished marble, a sound that seemed to travel up into the unseen heights of the domed ceiling and vanish into the dust of centuries. There is a peculiar weight to the atmosphere of a museum at night. It is as if the thousands of artifacts, the shattered pottery of Mesopotamia, the silent basalt gods of Egypt, and the cold marble of Greece are all exhaling at once, reclaiming the space that the living occupy during the daylight hours. We moved through the shadows of the Egyptian gallery, where the colossal granite heads of pharaohs watched our passage with sightless, eternal eyes. The silence here was not empty. It was a profound, pressurized stillness that seemed to ring in the ears. Holmes moved with a feline grace, his dark coat fluttering behind him like the wings of a moth. He did not look at the grand displays, but rather at the floor, the door frames, and the subtle layers of dust that coated the mahogany plinths. Our destination was the gem room, a sanctuary of reinforced glass and velvet, where the most exquisite treasures of the empire were kept under lock and key. The watchman informed us, his voice a ragged whisper that broke the sanctity of the hall, that the theft had occurred at precisely 11:47. The perpetrator had not broken a single pane of glass, nor had they tripped the mechanical alarms that guarded the perimeter. The object of the theft was a Faberge egg, a masterpiece of gold, enamel, and sapphires that had been a gift to the Tsarina. Now, the velvet cushion where it had rested lay bare. A small, circular indentation in the fabric being the only evidence of its former presence. Holmes knelt before the display case, his magnifying glass appearing in his hand as if by magic. He did not speak for a long time, his breath creating a faint, rhythmic mist on the polished surface of the wood. I watched him, marveling at the patience of his scrutiny. He was looking for the invisible, for the microscopic disturbances that a human presence inevitably leaves behind. The light from the watchman's lantern cast long, distorted shadows of the nearby statues across the floor, making it seem as though we were being observed by a gallery of ghosts. What Holmes found was not a fingerprint or a strand of hair, but a scent of faint, almost imperceptible trace of oil and ozone that lingered in the stagnant air. He leaned closer to the base of the pedestal, his eyes narrowing as he detected a series of minute scratches on the brass fittings of the lock. These were not the marks of a forced entry. but the delicate impressions of a tool that had been designed to mimic the exact vibration of the museum's own master key. It was a terrifying display of technical mimicry. The thief had not merely bypassed the security, they had understood the soul of the mechanism. As Holmes rose to his height, his expression was one of grim appreciation. The misdirection was perfect. While the authorities would be searching the docks and the pawn shops for a common burglar, the true predator was someone who understood the rhythmic pulse of the museum's routine. We stepped back out into the courtyard, where the fog was now so thick that the columns of the portico seemed to dissolve into nothingness. The cold air was a sharp contrast to the stale, historic breath of the galleries. Holmes lit a cigarette, the glowing tip a lonely spark in the gray expanse. He told me then that the egg was not the goal. It was merely a note played in a much larger composition. The thief wanted us to find these traces. They were breadcrumbs left by a mind that was beginning to enjoy the thrill of being pursued. As we climbed back into the hansom, the horse's breath pluming in the air like steam, I felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the midnight chill. We were no longer chasing a man. We were chasing a reflection that moved just as we did, always one step ahead in the velvet darkness of the London night. The museum remained behind us, a silent fortress of stone, guarding its secrets while we drifted back into the labyrinth of the city. The rhythm of the hooves, a steady hypnotic pulse against the silence. The following afternoon found us at the Diogenes Club, that most unsociable of London institutions, where the very air seems composed of ancient dust and the stifling weight of absolute silence. Mycroft Holmes had requested our presence with an urgency that was as rare as it was unsettling. As we stepped into the entrance hall, the transition from the bustling noise of Pall Mall to this tomb-like quiet was instantaneous. The thick crimson carpets swallowed the sound of our boots, and the grand mahogany panels of the walls seemed to absorb the very light of the day. Within these walls, talking is a cardinal sin, and the members sit like waxwork figures in their high-backed leather chairs, communicating only through the occasional movement of a newspaper or the subtle shift of a glass. It is a place of profound stillness, a sanctuary for those who find the world's clamor too taxing for the intellect. We were led to a private alcove at the rear of the building, where Mycroft sat, a gargantuan figure of static energy. His gray eyes, so like his brother's yet possessed of a broader, more lethargic brilliance, were fixed upon a small silver tray on the table before him. On that tray lay a gentleman's silk glove, unremarkable except for a faint, discolored smudge near the palm. The victim, a senior clerk from the Foreign Office, had been found in his habitual chair less than an hour ago. To the casual observer, it appeared he had simply drifted into a permanent sleep, his head lolling against the dark leather, a peaceful end to a quiet life. But the Diogenes Club does not tolerate the intrusion of death without a reason. Mycroft did not greet us. He merely gestured toward the glove with a heavy, deliberate movement of his hand. Sherlock Holmes leaned over the artifact, his magnifying glass already in position. The silence of the room pressed in on us, a physical weight that made the scratching of a distant pen sound like a thunderclap. He noted the way the silk had reacted to the substance, slight puckering of the fibers, a microscopic crystalline residue that shimmered under the gaslight. It was cyanide, but not in its common form. This was a sophisticated, lipid-soluble compound designed to be absorbed through the skin upon contact. The killer had known exactly which chair the clerk would occupy, exactly where his hand would rest, and exactly how long the poison would take to quiet the heart. It was a murder executed with the clinical coldness of a laboratory experiment. As I watched my friend work, I felt a creeping chill that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. The precision of the act was a mirror to Holmes's own methods. It required a level of observation, that bordered on the supernatural and understanding of the victim's every habit. The rhythm of the club's staff, and the chemical nuances of a rare toxin. Mycroft's voice, when he finally spoke, was a low rumble that barely disturbed the stagnant air. He informed us that a note had been found in the victim's pocket, written in that same elegant sloping hand we had seen at Baker Street. It contained no threats, only a single observation regarding the clerk's preference for afternoon tea and the exact temperature at which he liked his water served. The perpetrator was not merely killing, he was demonstrating a mastery over the environment. He was showing the Holmes brothers that he could move through their most secure sanctuaries, leaving behind nothing but a silent corpse and a flawless trail of logic. Holmes straightened up, his face pale and drawn in the dim light. He began to pace the narrow confines of the alcove, his footsteps rhythmic and soft against the velvet rug. He was retracing the killer's path in his mind, looking for the moment of vulnerability, the single slip that would distinguish a man from a ghost. The Diogenes Club, with its rules of silence and its frozen inhabitants, felt like a stage set where a macabre play was being performed for an audience of one. The afternoon sun began to fade, casting long, skeletal shadows across the room. The members remained in their chairs, oblivious to the tragedy that had unfolded in their midst, their faces hidden behind the spectator and the time. This was the horror of the case, the seamlessness of it. The killer had integrated himself so perfectly into the reality of the club that his presence was invisible. He was a shapeshifter, not of form, but of essence. As we prepared to leave, Holmes paused by the empty chair of the deceased clerk. He reached out a gloved hand, tracing the air where the man's head had rested. We were no longer dealing with a simple criminal. We were facing an architect of shadows who turned the very comforts of our lives into instruments of our destruction. The silence of the Diogenes Club followed us out into the street, a lingering cold reminder that in the heart of London, even the most profound peace could be a prelude to the grave. We walked back toward Baker Street in a shared heavy contemplation, the rhythm of the city, feeling increasingly like a countdown toward a confrontation we could no longer avoid. The journey to Cambridge was a rhythmic transition, a slow descent into a world of academic silence and the scent of ancient, decaying paper. As the train cut through the gray expanse of the English countryside, the steady clatter of the wheels against the iron rails became a hypnotic pulse, pulling us further away from the visceral grime of London and toward the intellectual isolation of the university. Holmes sat by the window, his gaze fixed on the passing hedgerows that blurred into streaks of green and brown, his reflection superimposed over the desolate landscape. He had not spoken since we left King's Cross, his mind occupied by the third letter, a cryptic missive that pointed directly to the Wren Library. This was not merely a change of scenery. It was a move toward the source of the killer's peculiar erudition. The air in the carriage was cool and carried the faint metallic scent of the locomotive steam, a reminder of the industrial heart that beat beneath the surface of our Victorian era. Upon arriving in Cambridge, the atmosphere shifted perceptibly. The bustling energy of the capital was replaced by the hollow echoes of footsteps on medieval stone and the distant, melodic tolling of chapel bells. We made our way toward Trinity College, where the Wren Library stood as a monument to human knowledge, its grand windows overlooking the quiet ripples of the river Cam. Inside, the stillness was absolute, a heavy, sanctified quiet that seemed to press against the chest. The sunlight filtered through the high, arched windows in dusty golden shafts, illuminating the rows upon rows of leather-bound volumes that climbed toward the ceiling. The scent here was intoxicating, to a scholar the musk of aged vellum, the sharpness of iron gall ink, and the dry, sweet aroma of cedarwood. It was a place where time seemed to have folded in upon itself, leaving us in a vacuum of history. The librarian, a man whose skin had turned the color of the parchment he tended, led us to the restricted stacks at the far end of the hall. He spoke in a whisper that was barely audible above the settling of the floorboards, explaining that a rare folio on the history of mimesis and theatrical deception had been tampered with. Holmes moved toward the designated shelf with a predatory slowness, his long shadow stretching across the spines of the books. He did not immediately reach for the volume. Instead, he stood and inhaled the air of the alcove, his nostrils flaring. He was searching for that same trace of ozone and machine oil, the signature of the man who walked in his footsteps. When he finally withdrew the book, the sound of the parchment opening was like a sigh in the vast emptiness of the library. The tempering was subtle, almost invisible to a man of lesser observation. Several pages had been delicately excised with a razor, replaced by counterfeits so perfect that the texture and weight of the paper matched the original 17th century stock. However, it was the content of the substitutions that froze the blood. The new pages did not contain the original text. They contained a detailed analysis of Sherlock Holmes's own psychological profile. It was an anatomical dissection of his genius, his reliance on chemistry to soothe the restless mind, his preference for the violin in moments of crisis, and his inherent isolation from the very society he protected. The writer had treated Holmes not as a man, but as a specimen to be studied, replicated, and eventually replaced. As Holmes read the words, his face remained a mask of marble, but I saw the slight tremor in the hand that held the folio. To find one's most private thoughts and habits mirrored in a public archive was a violation of the most profound nature. We were standing in the heart of an institution dedicated to the preservation of truth, yet here, truth had been twisted into a weapon of psychological warfare. The library, once a sanctuary of learning, now felt like a trap. Every bust of a philosopher that lined the walls seemed to be watching us with a knowing, cynical expression. The silence of the stacks grew oppressive, a weight that made the very act of breathing feel like a disturbance. We left the library as the shadows began to lengthen across the backs of the colleges. The river moved sluggishly beneath the bridges, a dark ribbon reflecting the fading light of the afternoon. Holmes carried the weight of the discovery with a grim, internal focus. He remarked that the shapeshifter was no longer merely mimicking his actions. He was attempting to inhabit his very consciousness. The transition from London to Cambridge had revealed the scale of our opponent's ambition. He was a man who had mastered the history of deception so thoroughly that he could rewrite the present. As we walked toward the station, the rhythm of our footsteps on the ancient cobbles felt like a countdown. We were returning to the fog of London, but the clarity we had sought in the halls of Cambridge had only served to darken the path ahead. The game had evolved from a hunt into a struggle for the very soul of the man I called my friend. The train back was a blur of gray light and shadow. The rhythm of the engine a persistent, driving force that hurried us toward a confrontation that was now inevitable. The return to London felt like descending into a subterranean world, where the fog of the previous days had transformed into a heavy yellow miasma that clung to the skin and tasted of coal smoke and river salt. Our investigation led us away from the grand thoroughfares and into the tangled veins of the city, specifically toward a narrow, forgotten artery known as Red Lion Passage. This was a place where the sun rarely reached the pavement, a canyon of leaning brick tenements and boarded-up shop fronts that seemed to groan under the weight of their own history. The air here was stagnant, carrying the damp chill of a cellar and the faint, sweet rot of forgotten things. As we moved deeper into the passage, the sounds of the main road faded into a rhythmic, distant throb, leaving us in a silence that felt heavy and expectant. Holmes walked with a cautious deliberation, his cane tapping softly against the uneven cobbles, a sound that echoed between the narrow walls like a ghostly heartbeat. We stopped before a nondescript green door, its paint blistered and peeling, tucked away in a recess that smelled of wet stone and old iron. There was no sign to indicate what lay within. Yet Holmes produced a skeleton key from his waistcoat with the confidence of a man returning to his own home. The lock yielded with a dry metallic rasp that seemed to vibrate through the very wood of the door. As we stepped inside, the transition from the cold street to the interior was marked by a sudden, pressurized stillness. We found ourselves at the top of a steep, wooden staircase that descended into a cavernous basement. The air was thick with the scent of beeswax, turpentine, and something sharper, the chemical tang of silver nitrate used in the development of photographs. Descending into that cellar was like stepping into a fractured dream. The space was illuminated by a dozen flickering gas jets, their low hiss providing a persistent hypnotic background noise. But it was the walls that arrested the senses. They were covered entirely in mirrors, large ornate looking glasses, small hand mirrors, and jagged shards of silvered glass pinned to the brickwork. In the center of this kaleidoscopic chamber stood a wooden mannequin, dressed in a charcoal gray frock coat and a silk cravat that were identical to the garments Holmes was wearing at that very moment. The effect was dizzying. Everywhere I turned, I saw a dozen versions of my friend and myself, reflected and distorted in a maze of silver. Holmes moved into the center of the room, his many reflections mimicking his every gesture with a terrifying mechanical precision. He began to examine the items scattered across a long workbench. There were prosthetic appliances made of fine wax, tinted to match the exact pallor of his own skin. There were jars of specialized stains for the fingers to simulate the effects of nicotine, and boxes of theatrical hair arranged by shade and texture. This was not the lair of a common criminal, but a rehearsal hall for a masterpiece of identity theft. The shapeshifter had been practicing more than just a disguise. He had been studying the very mechanics of Holmes's physical existence. I watched as Holmes picked up a small, leather-bound notebook. It was filled with sketches of his own gait, the specific angle at which he held his pipe, and the rhythmic pattern of his blinking during deep thought. The silence of the cellar was profound, broken only by the rhythmic dripping of water from a pipe somewhere in the darkness. It felt as though we were standing inside the mind of a man who had hollowed himself out to make room for another. The mirrors reflected the flickering gaslight, creating a world of shifting amber shadows that seemed to dance at the edge of my vision. Holmes did not speak, but his jaw was set in a line of grim determination. He was looking at his own life laid bare on a workbench, dissected into a series of habits and tics that could be bought and sold. It was a violation far more intimate than any physical assault. As we explored the further reaches of the basement, we found a collection of phonograph cylinders. Holmes set one onto a machine, and the air was suddenly filled with a crackling, ghostly reproduction of his own voice. It was a recording of a lecture he had given years ago at the Royal Society, but it had been slowed down, analyzed, and annotated in the margins of a nearby ledger. The shapeshifter was learning the music of his speech, the specific cadences and pauses that defined his authority. Standing in that mirrored room, surrounded by the echoes of a voice that was, and was not my friend's, I felt a sense of vertigo. The boundary between the original and the imitation was beginning to blur in the dim, shifting light. We stayed in that cellar for what felt like hours, a slow immersion into the obsessive reality of our antagonist. Every object in the room was a testament to a mind that had found its only purpose in the negation of its own identity. When we finally turned to leave, climbing back up the creaking stairs and out into the biting air of the passage, the fog felt almost welcoming in its honesty. The city of London, with all its grime and chaos, was a world of solid things. Unlike the silver labyrinth we had just escaped. Holmes paused at the green door, locking it behind us with a sharp, final click. He looked at me, his eyes dark with a realization he did not yet voice. We were no longer just solving a case. We were defending the very concept of a singular soul. The rhythm of our walk back toward the light of the main thoroughfare was faster now, a steady driving pace, as if to outrun the many versions of ourselves that still lingered in the mirrors of Red Lion Passage. The fog of London had shifted from a mere weather condition into a predatory force, a swirling gray entity that seemed to breathe with a rhythm of its own. As we emerged from the suffocating mirrors of Red Lion Passage, the city felt hollowed out, a stage set where the actors had vanished, leaving only the echoes of their footsteps. Holmes did not lead us back toward the safety of the main thoroughfares. Instead, he plunged deeper into the labyrinth of the East End, his movements driven by a silent internal compass. The air was thick with the scent of river mud and the sulphurous tang of coal smoke, a heavy combination that muffled the sounds of the distant metropolis. We were walking through a world of silhouettes, where the glowing orbs of the gas lamps appeared like dying stars in a collapsing firmament. Every iron railing we passed was slick with moisture, and the rhythmic tap of our soles on the damp paving stones felt like a countdown toward an encounter that was already written in the myth. I watched Holmes's back, a dark, angular shape cutting through the haze. He was not merely walking. He was hunting a shadow that he now realized was a part of himself. The psychological weight of the mirrored room had settled over us both, a lingering vertigo that made the solid brickwork of the warehouses seem fragile. Suddenly, Holmes came to a halt, his hand rising in a sharp, silent command for stillness. I froze, my breath pluming in the cold air. For a long moment, there was nothing but the distant, rhythmic dripping of water and the low, mournful groan of a foghorn from the Thames. Then I heard it, a faint, dry rasp of a footfall, precisely synchronized with the echo of our own. It was not behind us, nor was it ahead. It seemed to originate from the very heart of the fog itself, a rhythmic mirror of our presence. Holmes turned slowly, his eyes scanning the gray void with a terrifying intensity. A figure began to coalesce out of the gloom, some 30 paces away. It was a man of similar height and build, dressed in a long, dark Inverness cape and a deerstalker cap, his profile a blurred reflection of the man standing beside me. The stranger did not flee. He stood perfectly still, his hands clasped behind his back in a gesture that was painfully familiar. It was a confrontation of ghosts. The silence between the two figures was absolute, a pressurized vacuum that seemed to draw the warmth from the air. I felt a surge of primitive fear, the kind that arises when the laws of nature seem to buckle. This was the shapeshifter, no longer a collection of notes or wax masks, but a living, breathing defiance of identity. Without a word, the figure turned and melted back into the SG-1. Holmes did not shout. He began to run, his pace steady and calculated, not with the desperation of a chase, but with the precision of a mathematical pursuit. I followed, the cold air burning in my lungs as we wove through a series of narrow alleys that smelled of wet timber and old rope. The rhythm of our chase was hypnotic, the double beat of our hearts, the splashing of puddles, and the occasional glimpse of that dark cape flickering just at the edge of our vision. It was a dance through a graveyard of industry, past silent cranes and boarded-up counting houses that watched our passage with hollow, lightless windows. The shape-shifter moved with an uncanny knowledge of the terrain, navigating the treacherous shadows, as if he had spent a lifetime memorizing the geometry of London's despair. We reached a dead end near a derelict wharf, where the river lapped greedily at the rotting wooden pilings. The fog here was so dense that I could barely see my own hands. Holmes stood at the edge of the embankment, his silhouette framed by the ghostly white expanse of the water. The figure was gone, vanished as if he had never been more than a trick of the light and the damp. But as we stood there, a soft, melodic whistle drifted through the air, a few bars of a violin concerto that Holmes often played during his most solitary hours. It was a haunting, ethereal sound that seemed to vibrate within the very marrow of my bones. It was a signal, a final confirmation that the predator was not just watching us, but inhabiting our most private sanctums of thought and memory. Holmes stood for a long time, his head bowed, the rhythm of his breathing the only sound in the vast gray silence of the docks. He was not defeated. He was absorbing the reality of the challenge. The chase through the fog had been a demonstration of reach. The shapeshifter had shown us that he could walk the streets of London with more authority than the man who had protected them for decades. As we finally turned to find our way back toward the lights of civilization, the rhythm of our walk was slower, burdened by the realization that the mirrors of Red Lion Passage had followed us out into the world. The city felt like a vast unfolding crypt, and we were the only ones left to witness the slow erasure of the truth. We walked back toward the distant hum of the city, two men haunted by a third who lived in the spaces between their heartbeats. The confrontation in the fog had left a lingering, cold residue upon our spirits, a psychological frost that even the roaring fire at Baker Street struggled to thaw. We sat in a silence that was no longer companionable, but fraught with the heavy anticipation of the next move in this macabre game of shadows. Holmes had retreated into his inner sanctum of thought, his violin lying neglected in its case, while I attempted to find solace in the pages of a medical journal that seemed increasingly irrelevant in the face of our current enigma. The rhythm of the clock on the mantelpiece tick, tick, tick sounded like a hammer against the stillness, marking the passage of hours in which we were not the hunters, but the observed. It was nearly midnight when the final summons arrived, delivered not by a messenger, but found pinned to our door with a surgical scalpel that glinted wickedly under the hallway gaslight. I watched as Holmes withdrew the blade, his movements slow and deliberate, as if he were disarming a ticking explosive. The letter was written on the same heavy, cream-colored vellum, but the elegant, sloping hand had grown more assertive, the ink darker and more saturated. It was a formal declaration of war, a manifesto of a mind that had decided the world was too small for two versions of the truth. The shapeshifter no longer spoke in riddles or veiled metaphors. He issued a direct challenge to meet him at the Lambeth Marshes, a desolate stretch of the riverbank where the city's industrial might collapsed into a wasteland of mud and decaying timber. He claimed to have taken a hostage, not a person of status or wealth, but a symbol of the very innocence that Holmes had sworn to protect. It was a tactical masterstroke, a strike at the moral heart of my friend's character. As I read the words, I felt a deep, visceral shudder. The writer described the exact sensation of the fog against our skin, the specific scent of the tea we had shared that morning, and the precise sequence of thoughts that had led Holmes to the mirrors of Red Lion Passage. It was as if he were standing inside our very memories, looking out through our eyes. The intimacy of his knowledge was more terrifying than any physical threat. He signed the letter not with a name, but with a stylized drawing of a mirror, half shaded in black. It was a signal that the time for reflection was over, and the time for erasure had begun. Holmes looked at me, his face a pale, angular mask of resolve. There was no hesitation in his gaze, only a profound, weary sadness for the necessity of the coming struggle. The transition from our warm sitting room to the carriage was a descent into a darker reality. The hansom cab moved through the streets like a funeral barge, the horses' hooves creating a rhythmic, hollow thud against the damp stones. London was a city of ghosts that night, the grand architecture of the West End giving way to the skeletal remains of the docks and the sagging tenements of the South Bank. The air grew colder, carrying the brackish, sulphurous stench of the low tide and the metallic tang of the distant ironworks. We were leaving the world of law and order behind, entering a realm where identity was fluid, and the only truth was the strength of one's will. Holmes sat with his eyes closed, his fingers moving in a rhythmic, phantom-like motion, as if he were playing a silent concerto on a violin only he could hear. He was preparing his mind for a confrontation that would require every ounce of his analytical power. As we reached the outskirts of Lambeth, the fog became a physical weight, a wet shroud, that muffled the sounds of the horse and carriage until we seemed to be moving in a vacuum. The street lamps were few and far between, their weak, yellow light barely penetrating the gray gloom. This was the territory of the forgotten, a landscape of mudflats and rotting wharves where the river reclaimed the city's refuse. The silence here was absolute, a heavy, expectant quiet that seemed to vibrate with the threat of the unknown. We stepped out of the cab, the driver's face hidden in shadow, as he took his coins and hurried away, leaving us alone in the vast, shivering darkness. The ground beneath our boots was slick and treacherous, a mixture of coal dust and river silt that seemed to pull at our feet. Holmes took a deep breath, his nostrils flaring as he sampled the air. He was looking for the scent of the enemy, the trace of ozone and machine oil that had become our only compass. We began to walk toward the water's edge, our shadows stretching out into the mist like elongated, distorted versions of ourselves. Every creak of a distant piling, every splash of a rat in the shallows, felt like a deliberate provocation. The shapeshifter was here, watching us from the white spaces of the fog, waiting for the moment when our confidence would falter. The rhythm of our progression was slow and cautious, a steady beat of footfalls against the yielding earth. We were walking into a trap, and we knew it, yet the logic of the case demanded that we see it through to the end. The letters in Holmes's pocket felt like a weight, a collection of anchors that tied us to a man who wanted to sink us both into the depths of the Thames. As the first faint light of a distant factory fire reflected off the water, we saw a solitary figure standing at the end of a crumbling stone pier, a silhouette that was the perfect, terrifying twin of the man standing beside me. The final movement of the symphony was about to begin. The Lambeth marshes stretched out before us like a landscape from a forgotten purgatory, a place where the solid earth of London dissolved into a treacherous slurry of black mud and stagnant water. The air was thick with the suffocating scent of low tide, a mixture of rotting timber, industrial effluent, and the cold, metallic tang of the river. As we stepped onto the crumbling stone pier, the silence was so profound that the rhythmic lapping of the Thames against the pilings sounded like the heavy breathing of a submerged giant. Holmes moved with a predatory stillness, his gaze fixed on the solitary figure at the far end of the wharf. The fog swirled between them, occasionally obscuring the silhouette until it seemed to flicker in and out of existence. I followed a few paces behind, my hand resting on the grip of my service revolver, though the weapon felt absurdly inadequate against an enemy who fought with the weapons of the mine. We reached a small, dilapidated salt shed that leaned precariously over the water's edge. Inside, the darkness was absolute, save for a single lantern sitting on the floor, casting long, skeletal shadows against the warped wooden slats. Beside the lantern lay a man, bound and gagged, his eyes wide with a terror that transcended physical pain. It was Colonel Trench, a man of impeccable reputation and one of Holmes's oldest acquaintances. But it was not the hostage that arrested my breath. It was the physical evidence scattered around him. The muddy floor was covered in footprints that were identical to Holmes's own boots. And on the wall, written in charcoal, with a hand that mirrored my friend's perfectly, was a detailed list of the Colonel's secret transgressions flaws that only a confessor or a master detective could have known. Holmes knelt beside the victim, but as he reached out to loosen the bonds, he froze. His magnifying glass revealed a horrifying detail. The knots were tied with a specific, left-handed tension that Holmes himself used when securing fragile chemical apparatus. More unsettling still was the presence of a thumbprint on the Colonel's collar, a print that, upon closer inspection, showed the exact whorls and ridges of Sherlock Holmes's own thumb. Yet, it was mirrored, as if the person who left it was a reflection come to life. The rhythm of my heart accelerated as the sheer scale of the mimicry became apparent. This was not just a disguise, it was a biological forgery. The shapeshifter had not only studied the soul of his prey, but had somehow mastered the very minutiae of his physical being. The stillness of the shed was broken by a soft, rhythmic thud from above. We looked up to see a pair of legs dangling through a gap in the rafters, swaying slowly in the draft. It was a second victim, or perhaps a second version of the first. The atmosphere grew heavy with the scent of ozone and that familiar clinical machine, oil. Holmes stood up, his face as pale as the mist outside. He realized then that the Lambeth marshes were not just a crime scene. They were a laboratory of identity. The shapeshifter was demonstrating that he could not only replicate Holmes's genius, but could also commit his crimes using Holmes's own physical signatures. If the Colonel died here, the evidence would point to only one man in England. The river groaned against the wharf, a low, mournful sound that seemed to echo the despair of our situation. We were trapped in a world where the truth had been inverted. Holmes began to speak, his voice a low, steady vibration that seemed to anchor us to reality. He was not speaking to me, but to the shadows in the rafters. He began to deconstruct the logic of the scene, pointing out the microscopic errors in the mirroring, the way the charcoal stroke lacked the genuine frantic energy of a man in a hurry, and the specific scent of the ink which betrayed a chemist's over-precision. He was fighting back with the only weapon the shapeshifter could not truly steal, the innate spark of human intuition that lies beneath the mechanics of deduction. As the fog pressed against the open doorway, I felt the presence of the watcher receding, moving back into the velvet darkness of the marshes. The rhythm of the night shifted, the tension breaking just enough for us to breathe. We worked in a grim, focused silence to free the Colonel, our movements synchronized in the dim light of the dying lantern. The Lambeth case was a pivot point in our journey. It was the moment we realized that the enemy was no longer interested in a game of wits. He was attempting a total eclipse of the sun. As we carried the shaken Colonel back toward the distant, flickering lights of the hansom cab, the mud of the marshes clinging to our boots like the weight of 1,000 secrets, I knew that the next encounter would not be in a wasteland, but in the light of the public eye, where the illusion would be most dangerous. The rhythm of the city awaited us, but the shadows we carried were now our own. The Criterion Theater stood as a glowing beacon of gilded opulence amidst the swirling, soot-stained fog of Piccadilly Circus, its grand arched windows spilling pools of warm, amber light onto the damp pavement. Inside, the air was a suffocating mixture of expensive French perfumes, the heavy scent of hothouse lilies, and the faint, acrid tang of gaslight that flickered in the ornate crystal chandeliers. The grand staircase was a sea of black silk top hats and shimmering satin gowns, a rhythmic procession of London's elite moving toward the velvet-draped sanctuary of the auditorium. Tonight, however, the performance on stage was merely a prelude to the psychological drama that had begun to unfold in the private boxes. Holmes and I sat in the deep shadows of Box C, our presence invisible to the laughing throngs below. My friend was a statue of focused intensity, his opera glasses resting untouched on the velvet ledge. His gaze fixed not on the actors, but on the identical box directly across the vast golden expanse of the theater. The play was a light drawing-room comedy, yet the laughter of the audience felt hollow and distant, a rhythmic intrusion into the pressurized silence that existed between our box and its twin. As the first act drew to a close and the heavy crimson curtain fell with a soft, weighted thud, The lights in the house remained dim. It was then that the figure in the opposite box stood up. He moved with a deliberate, haunting grace, his silhouette framed by the dim glow of a wall sconce. He was dressed in the exact evening attire that Holmes had chosen for tonight, down to the specific tint of his silk cravat and the unique arrangement of the white carnation in his lapel. For a moment, the theater seemed to tilt on its axis. It was as if a mirror had been placed across the void, reflecting a version of my friend that was more polished, more certain, and terrifyingly more public. The shapeshifter did not hide his face. He stepped to the very edge of the ledge, allowing the stray beams of the stage lights to catch the sharp, familiar angles of his features. The resemblance was absolute. The thin, hawk-like nose, the high forehead, and the deep-set, searching eyes that seemed to perceive the very thoughts of those they fell upon. A murmur began to ripple through the stalls below, as members of the public noticed the celebrated detective appearing in two places at once. The rhythm of the whispers grew, a rising tide of confusion and morbid curiosity that threatened to shatter the decorum of the evening. It was a masterpiece of social sabotage. By appearing so brazenly in the light of the Criterion, the imitator was not just stealing a face. He was stealing a reputation, forcing the world to choose between the original and the reflection. Holmes rose to his feet, his movements slow and rhythmic, matching the pace of his antagonist. He stepped into the light, and for a heartbeat, the entire theater held its breath. Two Sherlock Holmeses stood facing one another across the golden horseshoe of the auditorium, a visual paradox that seemed to defy the very laws of reality. The shapeshifter raised a gloved hand in a mocking salute, a gesture that was so perfectly aligned with Holmes's own mannerisms that it felt like a physical blow. The silence in the theater was now so profound that I could hear the rhythmic ticking of my own pocket watch, a steady, driving pulse in the vacuum of the confrontation. Then, the stranger began to speak. His voice, amplified by the perfect acoustics of the house, was a flawless reproduction of the baritone resonance I had listened to for years at Baker Street. He began to narrate the details of the Lambeth case, twisting the facts with a subtle, poison-tipped logic that made Holmes appear not as the savior, but as the architect of the colonel's misery. It was a trial by theater. The audience, initially charmed by the spectacle, began to shift in their seats, their faces turning pale under the gaslight, as the shapeshifter's narrative took hold. He was using Holmes's own history against him, citing cases from my own published chronicles, and reinterpreting them as the work of a brilliant, bored sociopath. The rhythm of his speech was hypnotic, a steady, persuasive flow that seemed to wash away the foundations of the truth. Holmes did not interrupt. He watched with a clinical, terrifying patience. He was looking for the one thing a mirror cannot capture: the weight of a soul. He noticed the way the light reflected off the shapeshifter's eyes, a flat, metallic shimmer that lacked the restless human fire of the original. He noticed the slight mechanical perfection of the man's breathing, which lacked the irregular, organic rhythm of a living heart under pressure. As the theater staff hurried to restore order, the shapeshifter stepped back into the shadows of his box, vanishing as if he had been nothing more than a projection of the house light. The spell was broken, but the damage was done. The murmurs in the lobby were no longer of the play, but of the madness that had seemingly overtaken the great detective. We left the Criterion through a side exit, stepping back into the biting chill of the London night. The fog had turned a sickly, bruised purple under the city's lights, and the rhythm of the passing carriages felt frantic and disjointed. Holmes walked with his head down, his hands buried deep in the pockets of his overcoat. He knew that the stage had been set for the final act. The mimicry had reached its zenith. The ghost had stepped out of the shadows and into the light of the sun, and the world could no longer tell the difference between the man and the mask. We walked back toward Baker Street in a heavy shared silence, the echo of that duplicate voice still ringing in our ears like a funeral bell for the truth. The return to Baker Street felt like retreating into the final fortress of a crumbling empire. The fog had followed us from the theater, pressing its cold, damp face against the glass of our sitting room windows, as if trying to witness the end of the man who lived within. Holmes did not turn on the gaslights. He sat in the dying glow of the embers, a skeletal figure of shadow and silver. The silence was heavy, a thick, pressurized void that seemed to vibrate with the lingering echoes of the shapeshifter's stolen voice. I stood by the mantelpiece, my heart beating with a frantic, rhythmic pulse that contrasted sharply with my friend's absolute stillness. We were waiting. The logic of the pursuit had dictated that the mirror must eventually return to the source to shatter it. The room smelled of old dust and cold tea, the familiar scents of our domestic life, now tainted by the invisible presence of the intruder who claimed to own them. The front door downstairs creaked open, a sound so subtle it might have been a trick of the wind, yet it resonated through the house like a thunderclap. There were no heavy footfalls, only a faint, rhythmic brushing of silk against the banister as someone ascended the stairs with the effortless grace of a goat. The handle of our door turned with a slow, agonizing deliberation. As it swung open, the hallway light framed a figure that was the perfect, terrifying twin of the man sitting in the armchair. Sebastian Rowe stepped into the room, shedding his overcoat with a gesture that was so precisely Holmesian it made my skin crawl. He did not look like a criminal. He looked like the rightful owner of the room returning after a long journey. He walked to the sideboard, poured himself a finger of brandy, and inhaled the bouquet with a delicate flare of his nostrils, the exact movement Holmes performed every evening. For a long moment, the two men simply stared at one another, a confrontation of two identical souls, separated only by the flickering orange light of fire. Rowe began to speak, his voice a flawless replica of Holmes's baritone, rhythmic and calm. He spoke of the beauty of the void, the thrill of erasing one's own identity to become a masterpiece of another's making. He claimed that he had not merely studied Holmes, but had become the superior version of the detective without the burden of human attachment, the logic without the interference of a heart. He mocked the very walls of 221B, pointing out the microscopic flaws in the arrangements of the chemical bottles and the dust on the violin case. It was a verbal dissection, a cold, clinical attempt to make Holmes feel like an imposter in his own life. Holmes finally rose, his silhouette merging with the shadows until only his eyes remained visible, catching the firelight with a sharp, metallic glint. He did not argue, nor did he defend his reputation. Instead, he began to walk in a slow, rhythmic circle around the man who called himself his mirror. He spoke in a whisper that was lower and steadier than Rowe's, a sound that seemed to come from the very floorboards of the room. He spoke of the one detail Rowe had missed, the one thing that a mimic, no matter how brilliant, could never replicate. It was not a gesture, a scent, or a deduction. It was the scent of fear, not of the enemy, but of oneself. Holmes pointed to the Rowe's left hand, which was resting on the brandy glass. The fingers were perfectly still, but the rhythmic pulse in the wrist was a fraction too fast, a mechanical tempo that betrayed a mind terrified of its own emptiness. Rowe's composure did not break, but his eyes shifted, a momentary, microscopic flicker of uncertainty that was all Holmes needed. My friend moved with a sudden, explosive precision, not toward Rowe, but toward the desk. He produced a small silver atomizer and sprayed a fine mist into the air between them. The scent of lemons and scorched ozone filled the room. Rowe's reaction was instantaneous. He recoiled, his face contorting into a mask of visceral, uncontrollable disgust. It was a psychosomatic trigger, a hidden vulnerability Holmes had deduced from the very first letter's chemical composition. The shapeshifter had built his identity on the rejection of his own past, yet he could not escape the sensory memories of his childhood. In that moment of weakness, the illusion shattered. The hawk-like features remained, but the soul behind them was revealed as a hollow, trembling thing. I stepped forward then, the weight of the situation finally breaking the spell of the mimicry. Roe looked at me, and for the first time, I did not see Sherlock Holmes. I saw a man who had lost himself in the pursuit of perfection, a tragic figure who had traded his humanity for a reflection. Holmes stood over him, his expression one of profound, weary pity. The rhythm of the night had shifted from a chase to a vigil. As the first gray light of dawn began to bleed through the fog, the police, summoned by a prearranged signal, arrived to take Sebastian Roe away. He did not struggle. He walked out of the room with a hollow, rhythmic gait, leaving behind the stolen clothes and the borrowed voice. Order had returned to Baker Street, but the silence that followed was different. It was the silence of a sanctuary that had been breached and then reclaimed. Holmes returned to his chair, the rhythm of his breathing finally evening out as he watched the fog begin to lift from the street below. The mirror was broken, and the original remained, scarred but singular in the waking world. The echoes of the police wagon's wheels eventually faded into the rhythmic low hum of a London, awakening to a new day. Inside our sitting room at Baker Street, the air began to clear, the heavy yellow fog outside finally retreating before a pale, watery sun that struggled to touch the rooftops of Marylebone. Holmes remained in his armchair, his long, thin fingers interlaced in a gesture of profound contemplation. The tension that had gripped his frame for days had dissipated, replaced by a quiet, weary dignity. He looked not at the door where his shadow had departed, but at the fireplace, where the last of the embers pulsed with a faint, dying amber light. The case of the shapeshifter was closed, not with a flourish of trumpets or a public trial, but with a silent restoration of the self. We had survived a siege of the soul, and the sanctity of our shared history remained intact, though perhaps seasoned with a new, lingering wisdom. I moved to the window and drew back the heavy velvet curtains, allowing the gray morning light to spill across the worn Persian rug. The world outside looked remarkably ordinary. The same handsome cabs rattling over the cobbles, the same flower girls arranging their baskets, the same steady pulse of a city that cared little for the metaphysical battles fought in its drawing rooms. There is a profound comfort in this mundanity, a rhythmic reassurance that life continues its march, regardless of the ghosts we encounter. I looked back at Holmes and saw him reaching for his violin case. He did not play a challenging concerto or a frantic caprice. He drew the bow across the strings in a long, steady note that vibrated with a deep, earthy resonance. It was the sound of a man reclaiming his own voice, a melody that belonged to no one else in the vast, teeming metropolis. The locked drawer of his desk now contained the letters of Sebastian Roe, filed away alongside the records of Moriarty and the memories of Irene Adler. They were no longer threats, merely specimens in a vast cabinet of human curiosity. Holmes remarked, in a voice that had returned to its natural melodic cadence, that the greatest deception is not in the mask we wear, but in the belief that a mask can ever truly replace the wearer. He spoke of the difference between a mirror and a window, how Roe had seen only the reflection of a genius, while failing to perceive the window into the human condition that logic is meant to serve. We sat for a long time in that shared silence, the scent of fresh tea and the faint, lingering aroma of tobacco smoke creating a familiar sensory cocoon. The rhythm of our life at 221B had returned to its steady, predictable beat, a heartbeat that felt stronger for having been tested. As the morning progressed, the city's mist vanished entirely. leaving the streets of London bathed in a crisp, clear light. The mystery of identity, though solved in the physical sense, remained a quiet subject of reflection for us both. We had seen how easily the truth could be mimicked, yet we had also found the singular, irreducible spark that makes a man who he is. I watched Holmes as he eventually set down his violin and took up a book of chemical formulae, his mind already drifting toward the next enigma, the next challenge that would demand his unique perspective. The game was always afoot, but for today the game was simply to exist, to breathe the air of a world that was once again certain of its own boundaries. I invite you now to let the rhythm of this story settle within you, like the falling of a gentle rain upon the London rooftop. The fire has burned low, and the shadows have retreated into the corners of the room. You are safe in the knowledge that even in a world of mirrors, the truth remains a constant, unwavering light. As the clock on the mantelpiece continues its steady, rhythmic count, feel the weight of the day lifting, replaced by the profound, quiet peace of a mystery resolved. The streets of Baker Street are silent now. The fog has lifted, and the night is finally at rest. Sleep comes as the ultimate sanctuary, a place where no shadow can follow and no mirror can reach. The story is told, the threads are tied, and the world is exactly as it should be. Close your eyes and listen to the final, fading echo of the city as it drifts into a long, undisturbed slumber. Thank you for walking through the mist with us. Thank you for sitting by our fire and witnessing the quiet triumph of the light. No matter where you are in this wide, echoing world, remember that the truth is never truly lost. It is merely waiting for the right observer to find it. The game has reached its end, and the armchair is empty, but the warmth of the hearth remains. From the heart of London to wherever you lay your head tonight, I wish you the deepest of peace and the most restful of dreams. The case is filed. The case. Lamp is dimmed, and the story is complete. Good night, and may your own journey be guided by a lantern that never flickers.